legend of Bloody Mary, right? Like where I grew up, it was usually played with friends at sleepovers. We would go into the washroom, turn the lights off, and then you would have to stare into the mirror and chant Bloody Mary 3 times. You would stand there in the dark, terrified, and you would wait for her to appear in the mirror in front of you. And it was said that she could either like lash out at you, scratch your eyes out, or she could like pull you into the mirror with her to live out the rest of eternity with her, which is like super creepy. I really have no idea how or why the story of Mary Tudor turned into this weird, creepy game that we played as kids, but regardless, it did. This is one of the versions, and the version most closely associated with Britain. Like the game apparently has a little bit of a different version. Apparently, their version, you go into the bathroom and you chant, Bloody Mary, I stole your baby. This is done in an attempt to like taunt the spirit, to make her come forward. Pretty messed up kids game if you ask me, but I was totally guilty of playing it too, and I don't know why. But there is actually like more truth with that version of the game, because while Mary was alive, she did suffer from what was believed to have been a phantom pregnancy. So in a sense, like she did lose her baby. Like she obviously didn't have one, but she felt like she did have some sort of a ghost baby, you know what I mean? So yeah, this is one of the versions of the possible origins of the real Bloody Mary. Let's get into it. Grab my tea with this. Okay, so it was Bloody Mary, right? Let's find out. So Mary Tudor, she was born to King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And like I said, get the popcorn out because this shit is juicy. Catherine of Aragon was from Spain, and she came over to marry a prince named Arthur, who was born to the king. And Arthur's father was, of course, the King of England. Catherine and Arthur get married. She becomes Princess of Wales. And then, because it's 1501, Arthur gets sick and he dies. And the succession of the throne got passed down to his little brother Henry. Now, poor Catherine, she was pretty much a prisoner in England to King Henry at the time, because the douchebag didn't want to let her go home, because Spain had given England this huge dowry, and if she went home, that would mean England would have to give the dowry back to Spain. And Henry said, like, nope, I'm keeping the money. So yeah, Catherine was stranded in England. She had no idea what to do. The king was treating her pretty badly. He didn't want to pay like for her household because she was no longer the future queen, right? She was just kind of nothing at that point to the royal family, and it was pretty sad reading about this. But when Henry VII, the king, died, Henry VIII, the new successor to the throne, he was, I think, like 15 at the time. Was he 15? I might be wrong, but he was really young. He was like, hey, I'll marry Catherine. I'm in love with her. she would go on to have several more miscarriages, which was so sad. But of course, it was the 1500s, and this was very normal, but even more sad. Like, pretty much Catherine was blamed for this, because if you couldn't have a baby back then, it was the woman's fault, right? Something was wrong with her. Couldn't possibly be anything else. She did give birth to a son on one New Year's Day. They were over the moon, of course, but so sadly, the baby only lived for 3 weeks before passing away. It's hot in here. So by the time that Catherine was pretty close to giving birth to Mary, her, the king, everybody around them was just terrified that something bad was going to happen to the baby, because they'd been through so many experiences. So they were like extra careful with Catherine's lying in period. And lying in basically just meant like a month before the birth. The queen, or like other wealthy royal mothers, they would go into like a birthing room and they weren't allowed to leave, which first sounded like a prison or something to me, but after reading about it, it actually sounded kind of nice in a way. So the queen would stay there for a month, sometimes longer, up until the birth, and it was just this beautiful, dark, calming room. Like, no loud noises were allowed, no men were allowed. Just a very zen atmosphere in trying to give the mother the most calming, beautiful birth ever. So yeah, it was only women, like only the queen's ladies were allowed in there, and the people helping her give birth. No boys allowed. It was dark, warm, quiet. It was supposed to be representative of the inside of the womb, right? So tapestries would like cover the walls with beautiful images, and nothing like, I think they weren't allowed to have any like literal artwork or anything in there, in case like it caused the queen to have any sort of a bad dream or bad thoughts, because that was believed to harm the baby in some way. Yeah. After laying in on February 18th, 1516, Catherine gave birth to their daughter Mary. Obviously, the king had been hoping for a male, but they were hopeful that they would eventually have a son. They were going to keep on trying, and though she wasn't what was desired, it didn't mean that Mary was any less loved. She grew up like a very spoiled, very loved princess. She had servants and like people who attended to her every need. She was given the best education possible. She was taught music, languages, a very special, like really high education that Catherine had planned out for her, because she wanted Mary to be very educated. And just like the queen, Mary basically had like an entourage of women that would just be with her all the time, and it was called their household. It was like a household of people who attended to her and were with her all the time. And one of these women was named the Countess of Salisbury, and I think she was appointed as godmother to Mary, and Mary saw her as like a second mother. That's how close they were. And pretty much she had like over 20 servants just doing literally everything for her. She even had her own laundress. Like, that was this one woman's job, was to just wash Mary's baby clothes. So that's nice. Mary was very rich, very spoiled. she was engaged to somebody in France, like another baby in France. But that engagement was broken for whatever reason. 6 years old, Mary was engaged to a Roman emperor who was also her cousin. So, yeah. Okay. Her cousin was the Holy Roman Emperor named Charles V. 6 years old, married or engaged to her cousin. I know. This marriage would be an alliance against the French. So, even though a few years back the king had wanted to marry her to the French, now he was going against that, and yeah, they were forming an alliance against the French. Royal babies are just little, like, chess pieces in diplomatic relations, pretty much. I'm gonna marry this baby off to this country and form this alliance. And no, take that back. I'm gonna marry my baby off over here. When I first read this, I was like, oh, I just thought it was a cute little, like, cute little baby crush. Like, oh, they're gonna get married one day. But no, this was a strategic move on the part of her douchebag father. The reason that Henry VIII made the engagement was because he planned on invading France at some point. So he wanted to form an alliance to get their army together with his, right? Because he thought that the French throne was his ancient birthright. Because one country is like not enough, right? He's got to take over the other one too. And Mary's cousin Charles, he agreed that this would be a good alliance and he would gain the English forces on his side. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. We can invade France. But they tried to invade France and they failed, like, pretty badly. So I guess the French were stronger than they had anticipated. Weather was really bad and things just didn't go well for them at all. And apparently their failure to invade the country, it was all put on Charles. Like, the king blamed him for everything and he said, you didn't come up with a good enough plan. Isn't that the king's job? So Henry was like real angry with Charles and he said that their failed invasion was all his fault, and he started speculating that maybe something else was going on, like Charles was working with the French and he got all suspicious, right? And because of that he got very distrustful and he's like, okay, I can't marry my daughter off to this guy who can't even invade a country with me. And he starts discussing amongst, like, his circle of people who else he can marry off to. Like, which other country can I marry my daughter off to? And somehow these rumors of Mary marrying somebody else reached Charles, and he was pretty much like, excuse me. Charles hears about the possible breakup and he decides to call off the engagement first. Now at this point, one of the king's advisors, he tells everybody to calm the hell down, and he says we need to avoid Charles calling this engagement off because it's very important for us. So he tells little child Mary to send an emerald ring to her cousin as a promise of her future marriage to him. I know how messed up this is. And little Mary, she happily sends this ring off to her cousin because she's so young at that point. She actually really likes him. It's like a little kid crush on her older cousin. And she was like, yeah, I'm in love with him. Which I know, her mother's nephew, but she had like a crush on him, right? Because she was so young, she didn't know any better. And when Charles got the ring, he planned on going ahead with the marriage to his cousin. But remember, she was still really young at this point, and I know this was normal in the 1500s, but it's still freaking gross. Basically, Charles was growing really impatient. He was of marrying age. He wanted to go ahead and get things So I demand that she move out of your palace, come live in my palace, and she can start like learning how everything here works. You know, by the time we get married, she'll know how our court works and everything like that. And Henry, her father, was like, no. No. And at that refusal, that was when Charles broke the engagement off for real, and he immediately married Isabella. So Mary was like heartbroken, right? She thought she'd never get over this heartbreak, and it was her first young crush, and she'd been dumped pretty much in her eyes. But Catherine, she took the news really badly, because this meant that they would no longer have an alliance with Spain, because that was where Charles was from, right? She lost the last link that she had with her home country. So yeah, she was pretty sad about that. So the engagement was called off, and England basically doesn't have any strong alliance through marriage at that point. Like, I think they were pretty much on their own, and this is where things started to get a little bit scary, because while Henry did treat Mary as his heir to the throne, because she was his only legitimate child, there was nobody else, right? But he really needed a male heir, because with his only successor to the throne being a female, this made it more likely that somebody could just like swoop in and overpower them, because he didn't have like a strong male succession to the throne. I don't know for sure how it works, but that was what he was thinking. So basically, Henry was angry that he didn't yet have a son from Catherine, which would just be the best and most favored line of succession, right? And Henry, good old Henry, he started pondering through his little old noggin, wondering why God was punishing him with only having one child and a daughter at that, because him and Catherine were trying and not having any luck for his son, right? And then, after pondering for a little while, he stumbled upon an interesting little nugget of information. You ready for this? He was like, oh my God, I'm being punished. And here's why. In Leviticus, if a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother and will therefore remain childless. So, Henry had literally done this. He had married his brother's wife. He thought he was being punished. I mean, they did obviously have a child, right? They weren't childless. But for Henry, he basically considered himself childless at that point, because he didn't have a son yet. And to make things even worse for Henry, apparently there were now rumors going around that Catherine could no longer have children. So, cue the music, please, because this is where Anne Boleyn comes in, and we need to start listening to like that evil stepmother type music, you know? She was like the evil queen from Snow White, or Cinderella, the evil mother from Cinderella. That was Anne Boleyn. I'm sorry, but what a bitch. Cannot stand this woman. Fascinated to read about her. Gonna buy a book, but what a cow. This woman, Anne Boleyn. I always say Anne Boleyn, but I'm pretty sure you're supposed to say Boleyn, like 2 syllables. Boleyn. Wait, it's 2 syllables either way. Never mind. So, this woman, Anne, she had been a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine. So come on. And Anne Boleyn knew exactly what she was doing. She was there to steal the king away from Catherine, and that was exactly what she did. Henry was completely captivated by this woman. His ugly, beady little eyes just wandered away from his beautiful wife, went right on over was like flirting with him, I guess courting him back, if that's what you want to say. But she made it very clear that she was not just going to be his mistress on the side. Like, she wanted to marry him, and she's like, nope, I've got high standards. I'm not just going to be your little side piece, your little royal side piece. I want to be married. And he was like, okay, easy peasy. So in 1527, Henry decided that he was going to make Anne Boleyn his queen, and nothing was going to stop him. Not even the fact that he was already married to the Queen of England. He applied for a divorce, but it was a little bit complicated. Wait till you hear about this. So, he sends an appeal to Rome asking the Pope for a divorce from Catherine, and he did it in a pretty, like, low blow way because they were Catholic, right? Like, no divorce for you. So what Henry ended up doing was saying that my marriage to Catherine was never valid because she had been married to my brother, and that was against God's will. But unfortunately for Henry, that same year, something called the sacking of Rome occurred, where Spanish, German, and Italian troops, led by Charles V, attacked the city. And because of this, Pope Clement VII, who was the head of the Catholic Church when they were invaded, he was now a prisoner of Charles V. And the Pope, he was the guy that King Henry appealed to for his divorce from Catherine. And this is where it gets juicy, because the Pope was a prisoner of Charles, and Charles, remember, was the beloved nephew of Catherine. So that was good for her. So Charles quickly found out that King Henry was fighting for a divorce from his wife, and therefore fighting to remove the queen and princess's titles. Because in Henry's eyes now, or like what he was trying to prove, was that his marriage to Catherine was never legit, and that also meant that Mary was an illegitimate child, so she had no succession to the throne. What a nice dad. So Catherine wrote to her nephew, basically asking him, do not grant a divorce to Henry, because, like, as you know, my marriage to him was legitimate. And, okay, so Charles wrote back to Henry basically saying, like, how dare you try to demote my aunt and my cousin from their titles of queen and princess. They are amazing women. How dare you dishonor them like this? I'm not gonna give you a divorce, like, no way. instead of keeping the doctor at his palace to care for the queen and the princess, he sent his doctor off to take care of his girlfriend. So the Pope had delayed the legal proceedings until 1529, when the first trial against their marriage began. Catherine came in pleading with the court, saying how ridiculous this whole thing even was. Like, she was the rightful queen. There were no grounds for a divorce, right? She said their marriage was 100% valid. She swore again that her and Arthur had never consummated the marriage, so her marriage to Henry was completely legitimate. None of this made any sense. The court ended up not being able to make a decision. They said that the trial would continue later on, but it never did. Like, they never came back to discuss matters further. I guess they just never been through a situation like this before, maybe. But in the meantime, the king was done. Like, he was done with their marriage. He was tired of his old, infertile, boring wife, and he wanted to be with the young, flirty Anne Boleyn. So that was what he did. So Anne was very threatened by Princess Mary because she knew that Mary had the capability of turning Henry against her. And of course, she was kind of right? Like, Henry loved his daughter, and Anne was threatened that she might interfere with her plans to become queen. And she wasn't wrong, right? Mary wanted her parents to stay together, and she didn't want to lose her title as princess. So Anne did everything she could to really wedge a divide between Mary and her father, basically saying, I don't want Mary around anymore. And so as king, Henry listened, and he sent Mary away without Catherine. Now, their daughter was forced to live in this distant, isolated castle without either of them, and he wouldn't allow Catherine to go be with her either. It was so bizarre. So he blackmailed Catherine, and he said, you have to choose between being here with me or being with your daughter. If you leave the palace to go and be with Mary, you can never return. And probably terrified, Catherine said, okay, I won't leave you for our daughter. I won't leave you for anybody else in the world. And she felt that she had to be loyal to the king, or she might be killed, or something might happen to Mary if she wasn't loyal, right? But no, like, this was a strategic move by the king. He thought that by separating Mary and Catherine, it would make them lonely enough that Catherine would finally agree to his terms, which was for her to announce to England that their marriage really was illegitimate, and therefore they had grounds to get a divorce. And therefore they would also renounce wasn't really worried about this. He basically just said, like, okay, well, I'm now the head of the Church of England then. Like, no problem. And in the meantime, Anne was getting ready to give birth. Meanwhile, poor Mary and Catherine are still living in isolation. They're not allowed to talk to one another. They're not allowed to come home. Cat was getting very sick at that point, and Mary was also getting really sick. Mary was suffering from what historians think were like irregular periods, but they were like really bad. Like she was having intense cramping and pain, so bad that she would spend days in bed. She couldn't even get up to walk. And to top it off, Anne was acting like the evil stepmother from Cinderella. Like I said earlier, she was going around bragging about the fact that she had like demoted her daughter-in-law, and if Mary ever came back, she was basically just gonna make her work as a maid to her newborn child. So, like, literally Cinderella, right? But at the same time, and I love this, England was still rooting for Catherine and Mary. Like, they did not like Anne, and I don't blame them. And I love this even more because the entire reason that Henry had left Catherine for Anne was so that she could give him a son, right? Anne gave birth to a girl, and spoiler alert, she never gave him a son, so get wrecked. So after Anne's daughter Elizabeth was born, Henry did everything he could to make Catherine and Mary agree to his terms. He dismantled Mary's entire household, meaning she had pretty much nobody living with her, nobody to help take care of her. He fired her godmother, everybody, so she was very lonely and very isolated, and he basically had to do everything he could to make it look like she was not a princess. She was just an illegitimate child with no succession to the throne whatsoever. And a good way to make it look like Mary was just not a princess would be, at Anne's request of course, would be to force Mary to move home and act as a maid to her new half-baby princess sister. Mary did come home. She took care of her new sister, but she refused to admit that she was this illegitimate child because, one, she was very strong-willed, but two, she was a legitimate child, but they still treated her horribly. Even when Catherine's sickness got even worse, Mary was not allowed to go and visit her. And then in January of 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. And then only 4 months later, Anne, the woman who was pretty much responsible for keeping Catherine and Mary apart, she died. Anne Boleyn died, yep. She was beheaded for treason and adultery to the king. Even after both Catherine and Anne died, the king still wanted Mary to agree to his terms. Like, this guy just wasn't giving up. He was just, I think he had something going on in his head, I don't know. But yeah, he still wanted his daughter to give in to the fact that she was no longer a princess and no longer an heir to the throne. I think it was probably in part to her losing her mother, but also Charles, her cousin that she was still very close with. Charles really urged her to just, come on, Mary, just agree to your father's terms. Just do it for your own safety, your own security. was, I guess, now like officially his illegitimate child. She was now Lady Mary, no longer a princess. It wasn't all bad. So after she finally did this, she was given back her own household, her own expenditures and allowance. So I guess he started treating her like a princess again, but she didn't have the title anymore. 2 weeks after Anne Boleyn lost her head, Henry met wife number 3, and her name was Jane Seymour. Now Jane had been, can you guess it? She'd been a lady in waiting to both Catherine and Anne. And if you're thinking, like, great, here comes evil stepmom number 3, actually no. Jane seemed to be a pretty lovely person. She was very well liked, very gentle, very caring, and it was actually her who requested and helped reconcile Mary and her father's relationship. So this makes it even more sad that she died pretty quickly. After Jane gave birth to Henry's long-awaited son, the baby boy was healthy, but Jane died from postpartum complications, and she died in her sleep. So that was pretty sad. The king would go on to have another 3 wives. 1, 2, 3. There isn't time, but there was Anne of Cleves, who, how do I say this nicely? Her physical appearance was pretty subpar for King Henry's standards, and when he got a look at her face, he annulled the marriage for that reason. Then there was Catherine Howard, who happened to be 9 years younger than Henry's daughter, and she cheated on him a bunch, and she lost her head for that. You don't cheat on King Henry, or you're gonna lose your head. But he's allowed to cheat on you, just can't go the opposite way. And lastly, there was Catherine Parr. So Catherine was the last of Henry's wives, and they were actually married until his death in 1547. And Catherine Parr, she was free to remarry after he died, and she actually married a guy named Thomas Seymour, who, yep, he was the brother of Jane Seymour. So she married her husband's dead wife's brother. Keep it within the family, I guess. After Henry died, he actually surprisingly left quite a bit to Mary. So he left her what were called the Howard's lands. He left her £1 million per year. Holy crap. And 32 houses and manors. After he died, Edward, her younger brother, became king. And at this point, Mary was kind of thinking, like, good, I don't care, like, I'm set for the rest of my life. Everything's gonna be fine. Edward has people to counsel him through the ruling. They had it all set up, and yeah, Mary was gonna be just fine. But this is where Bloody Mary started to take shape, because Mary assumed that under Edward's ruling, the church would be similar to the church under Henry, Catholicism minus the Pope, right? Because her father had broken away when the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. But with Edward, things slowly started moving in a different direction. And again, there is so much information, I am just gonna try and sum it up quickly. So Edward had been raised Protestant. Mary had been raised devout Catholic, and she was still a very devout Catholic woman. And Mary had a big problem with her little brother trying to make these big changes to her beloved church. Basically, the people counseling Edward were trying to move away child king, I think we need to keep an eye on your sister. She might be a threat to us." And only being 9 years old, little Edward was just like, okay. So he told her, "Okay, we're gonna like send you away." And Mary, she's like, "No, I know what you're doing. I'm not going to allow that to happen." And she basically started a religious protest. Mary got all of her Catholic supporters together. They bring all of these religious relics and everything that is now like illegal. And she tells her little brother, "No, you can't do this. Like, you can't take this away from us." And her baby brother, the king, starts baby raging and like stomping his little feet up and down on the palace grounds. And he's like, "No, you have to do what I say because I'm the king." And from what I understand, basically he says, "You're not allowed to be Catholic anymore. You have to do what I say. Like, you have to be Protestant." But Mary, again, being so strong-willed, she said, "No, no way." And so John Dudley, with Edward's permission, has some of Mary's household arrested, like just to show her how serious they were. And he convinces Edward that his sister is a threat, and "I'm worried that she's gonna like come for you, come for the throne." And so he literally talks Edward into writing out both Mary and Elizabeth for their possible successions to the throne, even though they didn't have a reason for it. Like, Dudley just didn't like Mary, and he wanted her out of any possible claim to becoming queen. And it was apparently pretty easy for them to do this, because not only was she a woman, but she was still technically labeled as an illegitimate child. And now she was going against the church as a Catholic. So they had like all the fire they needed to like cut her out of the succession. And then Elizabeth, she was cut out too. And Edward, while he was doing this, he kind of said, "Well, I don't want to write Elizabeth out too, because we're really close. Like, I love both my sisters, but especially Elizabeth. I don't understand why I have to write her out as well." And John Dudley basically told Edward that, well, just like Mary, Elizabeth is also illegitimate, even though she wasn't. But he was like, "Yeah, if you're writing Mary out, you have to write Elizabeth out too. Those are just the rules, and you have to follow them." So little Edward, being so young and naive, thrown into the position of king, he listens and he does what his advisor tells him, and he cuts both of his sisters out of their successions to the throne. So basically, John Dudley, he was a bad seed. He was very manipulative for his own benefit, which we're going to get into. So pretty quickly after Edward writes this thing out, saying that neither of his sisters can ever rule as queens, he gets very sick. Now, Edward was dying from tuberculosis, and everybody knows that he is probably not gonna make it, right? Including his douchebag advisor. So what John does, while Edward is dying from consumption, he sits down with him and he basically says, "Okay, we need to agree on a replacement if you don't make it through this illness. And you know what, little King Edward? I have the perfect person to replace you on the throne. I think your cousin, who happens to be my daughter-in-law, and she happens to be Protestant, were still on Mary's side, remember? They were like, I don't know, it's a trap. You can't trust Edward's counsel. I would recommend turning around. And knowing that Mary still had a lot of love in England, she was a very smart woman. She turned around and she went home, thinking that if she did go to the palace where Edward was dead, she might be arrested and like thrown into the London Tower by Edward's council, or she might even be killed. So she wasn't going to take that chance. She turned around and went home. So on July 9th, 1553, the public is told that King Edward had died. And on this day also, Mary announces that she is the rightful Queen of England. And she was right. Like, she was the rightful Queen to England. She was the firstborn of the king, right? So Mary said, by divine law and human law, the crown of England has descended to me in the death of my younger brother. And she says pretty much to anybody who still supports me and who still loves me, will you please fight for me in my attempt to become queen, like to gain back my right to the throne. This is the real life Game of Thrones, ladies and gentlemen. Out of nowhere, Mary is then told, we already have a new queen. And she's like, what the hell are you talking about? And she's informed that Lady Jane Grey is the new queen. Your brother announced it. You know your cousin, Lady Jane. She's the queen now. Mary says, excuse me, Jane was appointed queen, like legally, right? But Mary challenged this and she fought for her rightful place as queen. And she was very supported in this because the people of England favored Mary and she won. Lady Jane Grey was only queen for 9 days. Then she was removed and the crown went to Mary. So Jane, her husband, who remember was John Dudley's son, and John Dudley himself were all arrested and eventually executed for treason against the king and queen, which John Dudley kind of deserved it. But Jane and her husband, very sad, because I'm pretty sure Lady Jane was very reluctant to become queen. It like came out of left field. I don't think she knew anything about Dudley's scheming little weasel plans. So I was kind of sad that she was accused of treason and killed, but yeah. Mary is now the queen, thanks to how beloved she was by the populace. And wouldn't it be just amazing if the story ended here? I think so, but it doesn't. Like, after everything Mary went through, being cast out of the family, being brought back in, having her loved ones executed, being separated from her mother after all of that horrible stuff, wouldn't it just be a perfect place for the story to end here? She fights for her right to become queen. She gains the crown. she didn't lay like any scary laws down or anything though at first. But then she started reversing Edward's new Protestant laws. So under Protestant rule, is that what you would call it? Again, I'm not religious. I'm sorry if I'm getting these terms wrong. I mean no disrespect whatsoever. Mary reversed these rules, meaning under Protestant rule, like under the new rules that Edward had made, clergy were now allowed to marry. They were now allowed to have sex, but this kind of stuff was a big no-no in Mary's religion. Like, clergy could not be married, they had to be celibate, all of that. So Mary undid all of this to go back to the old ways. So English Protestants, all of a sudden they began fleeing England to go to like Germany, Switzerland, and other countries to avoid her persecution, because she was kind of out for blood. She was real devout to her Catholic ways. Okay. And it's called, she issued a royal injunction. So she pretty much started reinstating everything under the old Catholic Roman Church. And eventually she got to the point where she reinstated something really scary called the hearsay law. Now this act had literally been taken away by her dad, which, you know how terrible he was, so that kind of says a lot that even he didn't want it. So basically, under this law, you would be burned alive at the stake if you went against the religion of the state. So yikes. So this was really scary because Mary was turning everything back towards her religion. Okay, so while that was going on, Mary was around 37 years old at this time, and she still had no husband, but she really wanted to start making some babies, cute little babies. It wasn't like nobody was interested. Apparently guys from England were just like lining up to marry her, but she was a little bit snooty when it came to potential spouses from England. She didn't want to marry an English guy. A little bit picky there, Mary. She wanted to marry somebody from a different country to form a strong alliance, which I guess was normal, right? I bet you can't guess who she settled on for a husband. You won't guess it. You won't. So, remember Charles V, her older cousin and former fiance? Mary marries his son, keeping it within the family yet again. So his name was Philip of Spain, and despite the blood relation, he was apparently a very charming, very well-educated man who would probably make a great man to be by her side, right? But Mary made sure that he was not allowed to have like any power whatsoever. He was just a little side piece to make babies with. They literally put regulations in making it so that Philip couldn't rule England like ever. Mary was the boss, and that was that. So time goes on. Mary gets pregnant, and she's nauseous, she has morning sickness, she's tired, achy, cranky, and her baby bump is growing. It's announced to England that she is pregnant. She's ecstatic, the people are excited, and then a month before the baby is due, she starts her lying-in period. The lying-in period ends. The end of May comes, and she's past her due date, and she still hasn't delivered. People say, okay, I guess we got your delivery date wrong, right? Another month goes by, and then another month goes by until they're at the end of July, and there's still no baby. And there's no baby because she was never pregnant, which I churches had to go back to Catholic services. The Book of Common Prayer was burned. You weren't allowed to have it. You weren't allowed to read it. Protestant preachers couldn't preach anymore. If any printing businesses were caught printing Protestant literature, they would have their presses taken away and therefore their businesses shut down. And these were very, very serious laws. And if people didn't follow them, they were going to be burned alive at the stake. And Mary started burning people alive. So I believe the first two people were bishops who disagreed with everything that she was doing. They believed that Mary had no right to tell them that they couldn't practice Protestant, but Mary was dead serious in returning England back to Catholicism, and to prove her point, she killed these two bishops along with 280 more people who defied her new laws. They were burned at the stake, like these poor innocent people. That's not something that just the queen had to do. That was murder. She straight up murdered 282 people. So yeah, at 41, Philip finally returned to England at Mary's request, and after his return, she announced again that she was pregnant, but nobody believed her. And I'm pretty sure she went through several false pregnancies, and I don't think she was ever actually pregnant. I think it just didn't work for her. Historians actually think that Mary may have had uterine or ovarian cancer, which may have explained why when she was younger she had such intense pain associated with her period, which may have also explained why she was never actually able to get pregnant. But anyways, on November 17th, 1558, Mary died after catching what I think was consumption, but she was already really sick anyways, and people believe that it was some type of cancer that had progressed to a point where she definitely didn't have a chance to fight off the illness, which pretty sure was consumption, and she passed away. Now, Mary knew that she was dying, and before her death, she left Elizabeth, her half-sister, as her successor. Elizabeth became